So I'd like to add my welcome to this town hall about racism and bias. This is something that is personally very important to me. The position of the medical school is that we have zero tolerance for any forms of racism and bias. But we have a lot to do. We've been working on this for several years, but we're going to do a lot more over the next couple of years. Like many other medical schools and medical centers, we have a lot to learn on how to change attitudes and improve issues related to racism and bias. And I view this town hall as a learning experience, a listening experience for me personally. We're developing further initiatives that we've started several years ago. You're going to hear several presentations about that, and I encourage this to be a discussion once you've heard about our presentation. So if you have new ideas that we need to incorporate into our plan, we're going to listen. So again, thank you very much, and David, let's start the program.
So we're incredibly grateful for people coming. I know everyone's busy, class work and everything else. I'm here speaking not for myself, for our leadership team in medical education, many of whom you're all very familiar with. They're all sitting in the front row. I can call them out by name one by one. Joy Colelli, Michelle Sante, Leona Hess, Manjul is here also from admissions, Valerie Parks, Shashi Anand, Rina Karani, Pete Gliato, Angel Palermo, and Gary Butts. I believe this is the most important thing that any of us has done in our history at Mount Sinai. And we've had different histories at Mount Sinai. Some of us have been here for longer than others. But there's nothing that's more important than what's about to happen over the course of the next hour and what we hope to achieve over the course of the rest of our lifetimes here. I want to, just for a little bit of context before kind of diving in, just get a sense of who's in the room. And I know other people will come in over the course of the time we have. Who are if you just raise your hands, students in the room? Okay. Faculty? Any faculty? Plenty of faculty. Staff? Lots of staff, wow. And who doesn't fit in any of those categories? Is there anyone that I sort of left out outside of the visitors, interested parties, allies? So a couple of other things. We've had a fair number of discussions related to this and unrelated issues recently. And they've all been very, very challenging discussions. I want to point out in particular that I think all of us want to be sensitive to the people in the room, students, faculty, staff of color, who have to sit in a room like this and listen to this kind of a discussion. I can only imagine if I really try to personalize it, if I was an institution that was really struggling with anti-Semitism, and I was one of the small handful of people who were Jews and was sitting in a room and the dean was talking about it, I would feel all sorts of horrible things. And so I'm especially grateful that you're in the room, if you are, and I just want to acknowledge that it's not an easy discussion to listen to if you feel like you're on the receiving end of it. That's certainly not the intention, but I want to be cognizant of it. I know everyone's come here to listen. We have come here to listen as well. I do have a suspicion that having heard the same words, there may be people who leave at the end of this hour frustrated and angry about what we're about to do to their school, changing the playbook, changing the rules on them. This is not what they signed up for. And there may be people who leave the room feeling frustrated and angry that we are doing nothing, that we're going right back to discussions and rehashing the same old stories and data and not moving the boulder further up the hill. And that's not unexpected. I think there are probably as many perspectives on this as there are people in the room. And what we hope to do is to bring you all in over the course of time, regardless of how you feel leaving the room, and obviously especially if you feel leaving the room energized and inspired as we have been. We've been in the same place, our leadership team. We started a little while ago, which I'll talk about a little bit of the history of it, and came to this from very different places in our hearts, in our minds, in our personal lives. And this process has transformed every single one of us in every aspect of our lives in very powerful ways that I can say for me has never happened to me over the course of my lifetime. So I say that all again as sort of context and understanding that we're talking to people, some of whom have been living this their entire lives, some of whom have never had a conversation about this, and many of whom are somewhere in between, and we don't expect you to all walk out with the same impressions, the same perspectives. One of the things that we've struggled with most as a team is, and you'll be surprised maybe to learn, just because we've been working together, some of us for decades, is actually trusting each other, believing in each other, making ourselves vulnerable to each other around these issues. And also dealing with resistance among ourselves, sometimes actively resisting something, sometimes passively, showing up late to a meeting, not answering someone's email. We've really tried to work that through over the course of time, and I think have come to a better place. It's taken about 3 years, a little more than 3 years, and the only other thing that I want to say in terms of context is a couple of words about the person who has helped us through this process, who's here. Her name is Leona Hess. Some of you know her. Many of you have no idea who she is. Leona is someone who came to us first as an external consultant, someone with a lot of expertise in how to handle and manage people, how to train leaders and build teams, how to address issues of racism and bias. She comes with a background in social work, a PhD in social work from Columbia. And for us, she has been first a consultant, a team member, a guide, a mentor. And so I want to shout out to Leona and thank you for everything you've done for us individually and collectively. So I have some remarks written down because I want to make sure I don't miss stuff. I'm going to try as much as I can not to read as if I'm delivering a speech. So Eric Garner, July 17th, 2014, was killed by the police among a rash of other young black men who were killed by police all over the country. And then about 6 months later, December 10th, 2014, was the National Medical Student Die-In. And I mentioned those 2 points because that is one bookend. Pretty soon after that, a group of students came together, called themselves the Anti-Racism Coalition, and I don't know if they called themselves that from the very beginning, but it was the Anti-Racism Coalition, and they did an enormous amount of work to try to organize and categorize for us, teach us about what was going on at this institution related to racism and bias, that, again, among the various people in our group, we were either completely oblivious to or somewhat aware of or very aware of, but had not in any way come together to address. They broke things down into the obvious areas that are functional areas of what we do: curriculum, student affairs, admissions, recruitment, but also faculty, role models at this institution of color in their absence, and then the clinical environment. These students devoted an enormous amount of precious personal resource to do this. It was a lot of work. It took a lot of time. It was done brilliantly. It took a lot of personal courage. They sat in a room with all of our leadership, Dr. Charney, then the president of the hospital. We had a couple of meetings. And so I want to acknowledge the fact that they stuck their necks out in a very, very big way. And it was almost, I don't remember exactly what month it was. It's been 3.5 years. They said a lot of words that we were not ready to hear at the time. Some of the words were kind of easy words: transparent, authentic, intentional. We didn't hear them. And then they said words that were hard to hear, very hard to hear, and some of those words we still grapple with: racism, systemic or institutional racism, white privilege, white supremacy. And so it's taken us a journey, and that's a historical perspective. I know that it's very brief. I don't want to belabor it, but I wanted to acknowledge it. And I want to talk a little bit about where we're at today. And I want to start with those terms. So, sorry, dry mouth, no beta blockers. So we've each had a very, very different exploration of this. Some of us have learned a lot through sharing. Some of us have learned a lot through reading. All of us have learned a lot continuously from that point on from students. So places like this, institutions, organizations, function in ways that have been predetermined for generations by a society that historically in this country has been white, predominantly white. And so the methods we go about doing things, the processes, the policies that exist are geared towards the demographic that this country has been predominantly made of for the longest time. It's a struggle. It has been a struggle for me to wrap my mind around what does it mean that something is institutionally or structurally racist. The silliest example that I can think of, but that really brought it home for me, has to do with going to the bathroom in a stadium where women are waiting online, usually 50 outside the ladies' room, and the men are just waltzing in and out and using the urinals. And whoever it is that has built historically stadiums has not thought at all about the perspective of women who need to go to the bathroom. It's sort of a silly example, but there are so many things inherently flawed in institutions like this, despite the best intentions. The core values of an institution, the patterns of the way that we think, the way that we set up systems, and it's not just medical schools, it's everything in society, is structural racism. Privilege is also a term that I think we struggled with a lot. So I'm a white, middle-aged Jewish man. My parents came here when I was 5 years old. They struggled to make a living. They set education on a very high pedestal for us as kids and insisted that we do it. And so I've gotten to the places that I've gotten through a lot of hard work and determination. I feel like I've earned a lot of the privilege that I have. At the same time, I have recognized in the last 3 or 4 years, and again have learned from students, that there are lots of things that I didn't earn. I walk into a room as a man, sometimes in a room with women, or I walk into a room as a white person, sometimes in a room with black people, and I'm typically the one people will listen to or will look towards for an opinion. How would I ever have noticed a thing like that until someone pointed it out to me? A couple of years ago, Dr. Butts and I went to Xavier, and we sat in a room talking about recruitment opportunities, pipeline potentially between Xavier and Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And the woman who was leading the discussion around this big board table was an African-American woman, probably around 70 years old, who had multiple leadership positions at Xavier over the course of her lifetime. And Dr. Butts was sitting on her right, and I was sitting on her left, and there were people all around the table. And we went around and introduced ourselves pretty quickly. And for the rest of the meeting, over an hour, she rarely looked in my direction. Anytime she had a question that was related to Mount Sinai or medical education or whatever it was, she would turn to the right and look at Dr. Butts. And this is not a rude woman. This is a sophisticated, gracious woman. And I didn't have the courage to ask her, but she taught me a really important lesson. She did not look in my direction practically even once. And I felt that isolation. I felt that completely marginalized in the conversation. And so there's a privilege that I have as a white person, as a man, as someone who's straight, all the things that I am that other people are not, that makes me more often the center of attention in a room or more likely to get resources than other people. And I didn't earn any of that. I came out white. I came out male. And then the other one that I wanted to touch on is what I alluded to before. We live in a country that historically has been white, dominated by people who are white. And it's not just demographically. I know people talk a lot about the demographics and what this country will look like demographically in 20 or 30 years. But the culture of this country is predominantly white. The values are predominantly white values. The cereal boxes, the movies, I mean, think of anything that we are exposed to on a daily basis. It is predominantly white. White culture, white institutions reign supreme in this country. I don't think there's any way to argue that. And that is white supremacy. When I was younger, or before this brief period of time now, when someone said to me the words white supremacist or white supremacy, I had images in my mind of some of the images you probably have in your mind. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that whiteness reigns supreme. And white supremacy is something that people who are not white have to struggle with every single day. So where are we at now? We are in a society, in a country, in a city, in a profession, in a health system, in a medical school that have always been and continue to be torn apart by some of these issues, by racism. Those of us who are white simply haven't noticed it, right? Haven't had to confront it, haven't had to deal with it. It's completely invisible to me, to us, just like the color of my skin is completely invisible. I've never given it a passing thought, ever. And so I think that compared to where we are 3 years ago, we were 3.5 years ago, when the students came to us and said, curriculum, student affairs, admissions recruitment, clinical environment. Where we're at today is not terribly different. If I asked you a show of hands of incidents of or evidence of bias and racism in every one of those spheres, even if we take them one by one, by a show of hands, what do we think? In student affairs at this medical school, are there still incidents of bias and racism that you have seen, that you have experienced yourself or that you've seen other people experience? Just raise your hand if that's the case. What about in admissions and recruitment? How about the clinical environment? And curriculum? Yeah. And this is not meant to be a vote. I just want to kind of bring you in to the discussion too, and also to demonstrate for people around the room that I'm not talking about something that is happening rarely or behind closed doors. It's happening all the time, every day. At the same time, we've done a ton. We have done so much over the course of the last 3 years to try to address things, but have not accomplished much at all. And here's part of the reason. Part of the reason, this is an iceberg. It doesn't look like an iceberg, I'm sorry, but it looks like a pretty cool iceberg. The way that we have functioned, and I think the way that most institutions function, the way that most people function is something comes up. A student brings a complaint, or we recognize something that is wrong. We call that an event. What happened? We try to address it. It's all pretty linear, and we're pretty good at it. We try to tackle the problem, we come up with a solution, we change something, and sometimes it works, or sometimes it looks like it's worked, and sometimes it doesn't work. And the reason that we haven't accomplished a lot despite doing a lot is what you're looking at here. So the deeper you go in this iceberg, for every event that happens, we've never really taken a careful look at what underlies that event. And this is just one way of demonstrating it. No event happens in isolation. Every event is part of a trend. You can be oblivious to the trend, but the trend is always there. And no trend happens without underlying systemic structures that influence it. Patterns, relationship, culture of an institution, and what are called mental models, assumptions, beliefs that people have. And from what we've learned in the last 3 years, this is at the core of the problem. This is the core of why it feels like we're constantly doing more and more and more and not really accomplishing very much at all. And so that we look not that different as an institution 3 years later than we did 3 years ago to the students who had the courage to come up and talk to us about it. It's ingrained so deeply, the inequity, the racism, that we've come to accept it. Until this day, we've sort of come to accept it. And actually, worse than accept it, we've kind of come to expect the fact. Right? You almost expect the fact that some people are just not going to perform as well as other people in medical school. Some people are just going to have struggles that other people don't have to deal with. If for a moment you flip that in your mind to whoever it is you are sitting in the room, whatever your identity is, if this was happening consistently to women, or to students who are Jewish, or to students who came from, I don't know, Yale, in a pattern, in a recognized pattern, would we just sort of accept the fact that that's kind of the way that it is and nothing really can be done about it? Absolutely not. And so our goal is to drive down to the core of that iceberg, not stop addressing events, identifying them, trying to solve the problems, but at the same time drill down to the core. Because if we don't do that, nothing that we do will be sustainable at this institution. Every one of us you see in the room is going to be gone at some point, and if we can't do something that becomes the lifeblood of the way the medical school thinks, then we will have accomplished absolutely nothing. So the question of why is change necessary, I feel like a lot of what we talked about, what I mentioned already, kind of feeds into that. There are an endless number of examples of why we need to make a fundamental change, but I want to add another perspective, and that is kind of a self-reflection. As a medical school, we claim to believe in justice, equity, human dignity, advocacy, activism, all words you're very familiar with, for our patients and their communities. And we are not making a difference for our own students. It's shocking, sort of the sea of hypocrisy. We talk about all of this, for the sake of our patients. And we all believe in it deeply, and that's why we come here, that's why we work here. But we look inside our own community, we're not doing it for the people who are members of our own community. Despite our efforts, we have not had a meaningful impact. And so, if I ask, have we done anything to rebalance the stark contrast in privilege between white and black students that preceded their arrival in medical school? We have not. Can we claim to be any different than the societal racism, this sort of assault on equity that our students experienced before they entered medical school? We cannot. And so we believe that the reason for that is we have not dug deeply enough. We have not created an environment here where we are open to the idea of thinking completely differently about these issues and addressing them differently. If you need a reason for change and why it's necessary, just imagine for a minute what the future looks like if we do nothing more about this. How bad it will continue to be or how much worse it can become. And I want to be clear that not doing something about it or doing something about it is absolutely a choice that we make. We choose to do something about it. There is no more option of we're not capable of it, it's too complicated, it's too expensive, the whole world out there is racist, there's no way we can't create something in this little safe bubble. Unacceptable. We choose to do something about it. The something for us started, I don't know exactly when it started. It started when students came to us. It's been an evolving process, but the something for the school starts today. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. And a lot of it has to do with what we articulate as a vision for the school. And I'm sure if you've read about visions, you can have multiple visions in your life for different things. So our vision for the medical school is to become a health system and health profession school with the most diverse workforce, providing health care and education that is free of racism and bias. And this little schematic tries to describe what that's going to look like, and I want to walk through a couple of elements of it. So our missions within that vision are, on an individual level, increased adoption of an anti-racist approach, a racial justice lens, and a bias-free mindset, behavior, and practices in everything that we do, every aspect of what happens in the medical school. On a system level, to transform our school and our community to an environment that is actively identifying and explicitly addressing all forms of racism and bias by elevating racial justice, elevating health equity, and elevating underrepresented voices and experiences. It's aspirational. So the question is, how do we do it? And how do we do it ties right into what we have learned about something called change management. Change management is something that some of you may be familiar with. It is completely new to us, to our leadership team, something that Leona has introduced to us and very carefully over the course of the last year and a half or so has taught us not only what it is, but how to practice it. So change management is a structured approach to changing the culture, the assumptions, the expectations of an organization. It is about never again settling for fixing a process, creating a new program, replacing a person or people who are bad eggs. It's not about that. That doesn't work. It's a systemic problem. Racism and bias are systemic problems. They require a systemic solution. No more, and this is there's a very delicate balance to strike here. We're going to continue to chip away at things that come up that we think that we can fix with all of your help. But we're not going to focus, which is what we have been doing, 90% of our energy on that. We're going to have to split our energy between doing that and digging down into the root causes of what's going on and what's continuing to drive this problem. And change management is broken down into three big categories. One of them is content, one of them is process, and one of them is people. The content piece is a lot of what I talked about before. So as you change an organization, you change the content of what you're doing and how you're doing it. Maybe you do have to have a new admissions process. Maybe you do have to have a different way of evaluating students. The content stuff is what we are good at. We can always be better, but we will continue to do the content part. The people and the process are much more challenging. So, maybe not yet. So the people in the process I want to describe in the following way. The big picture of change management is going to be that in the coming weeks, we're forming a guiding coalition. Some of this is going to sound a little bit jargony. Everything has labels, but I'm going to try to stay away from jargon as much as I can. The guiding coalition is going to be representative of every sphere in the medical school that we want to influence, so that all people have a voice in influencing change, and in turn, everyone is influenced by that change. The spheres are going to align almost perfectly with what students came and told us 3.5 years ago. Recruitment and admissions, curricular affairs, student resources, enrollment, financial aid, housing, security. The student body itself as an independent sphere, even though students are woven into all the other spheres, and then the clinical environment. Those are the 6 spheres. I was supposed to show the slide. Those are the 6 spheres, each of which will be represented in this guiding coalition. And the rest of what you see there are the other elements that are woven throughout what we do. The leadership group is the leadership team that I mentioned. A much smaller cohort of us in leadership have been the change management team. We've been feeding the flames of this. And ODI CMC, all of you are familiar with, are a thread that will be woven throughout everything that we do. Each sphere is going to consist of a lead and co-leads. And each sphere leader is someone who's going to have legitimate decision-making authority. This is not an advisory board. This is a group that decides the direction forward. It is made up of the people who are running the medical school now and a much wider swath included in that process. And so part of the people in change management is not using and thinking with the same group of people over and over again trying to solve the same problems. It's bringing in many, many voices across every area that we have. Students, faculty, house staff, everyone. At the end of my remarks, you'll meet each of the sphere leaders. The student sphere is still working on its leadership structure, so there won't be a student who comes up, but each other sphere leader will come up and talk just for a couple of minutes about what they hope to do over the course of the next 6 months to a year. The Guiding Coalition is going to start by being trained together in change management, and Leona is going to do that training. It's going to meet regularly, and ultimately it's going to determine the change targets and the interventions that we put in place to address racism and bias. There are a couple of really important elements for it. And there are things that I'll go back to the degree to which we struggled with as a leadership team, but also things that you have experienced as students, faculty, and staff that we have not done well. A lot of it has to do with communication and transparency. How well do we share information? How much information do we share? How consistently and accurately do we do that? And we have not done that well. And so a big part of having a guiding coalition is feeding into the process of communicating in a very open and transparent way on a regular basis in both directions, so that the sphere leads and the guiding coalition are taking information back to their constituents and bringing information back to the guiding coalition from their constituents. It has to happen on an ongoing basis, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happens towards the end. The other part that I also mentioned early on that is going to be a serious challenge for the people on this guiding coalition and for the rest of this process is the 2 elements of trust and resistance. And you don't really know what it's like to trust someone until your back is up against the wall and you are forced to. You're relying on them for something that is potentially life-changing. And it's a very challenging thing to do. We had a meeting with students last week related to the guiding coalition and spheres, and one of the students, many of the students alluded to this, but one of them in particular spoke eloquently about earning someone's trust. It's easy for me to get up there and say, trust is really important. It's a core element of how we're going to make this successful. And the students said, and all of them in the room obviously said, you haven't earned our trust. If you want our trust, that's great. You need to earn, you need to prove to us that you're capable of doing this. And you can't argue with that. You can't just expect someone to make themselves completely vulnerable to you, especially if they feel like they've made themselves vulnerable to you over and over again and have been kicked to the curb each time. Sorry. At the same time, if you hold me at arm's length for too long and say, well, you haven't earned my trust yet, you haven't earned my trust yet, you haven't earned my trust yet, there's a very uncomfortable dual dynamic that's going to have to develop over the course of this process. I am committed, we are committed to doing everything that needs to be done to earn your trust, everyone's trust. But that never happens until you flip the switch and decided to give us your trust, and then together we struggle with it. If we're held in a place, and I'm just not saying just we, the 5 or 6 people in the rest of the room, all of us who are involved in this process, who are thinking about or planning to get involved in this to varying degrees, if we don't figure out a way to take that first small leap of faith in both directions, we're not going to make a lot of progress. We're going to end up talking at each other, which is what we've been doing for way, way too long. And linked to that very deeply is this question of resistance. And learning again from Leona about the way change management unfolds in organizations, there are people who will let you know right up front on day one that they are resisting. This is BS. I'm not doing this. I've got other jobs to do. I have no time for this. I actually don't even believe that there's that much racism and bias in medicine, et cetera, et cetera. And that is something that we're all going to have to deal with, but that's the easy resistance. The harder resistance is people who quietly or passively resist or just become sort of non-participants. And we'll figure out how to do it together. But the resistance is not acceptable. Now, not acceptable doesn't mean that I or we are rejecting anyone who's labeled a resistor. Everyone is an ally in this. Our approach to this is everyone is an ally, from the most aggressive to the most passive resistor. Everyone needs to be in this process if we're going to make it a fundamental part of the way the medical school functions. But it's going to be very challenging to do that, and we struggle to do it even among ourselves. So no matter what role it is that people play, I want them to keep that kind of frame of reference in mind. It's entirely possible that some people will be holdouts. No matter what happens, they will continue to resist or not trust. And you have to respect that. But those people will be left behind in the process. And that's also okay. It's impossible to do anything like this. It's going to be universally true for everyone. So that's the people part of change, right? I said content and I said people. And then process is interesting too. Process is easy to get tripped up on because we have so many processes in medical school, sort of an endless litany, student handbook, faculty handbook. We're not talking about a process, we're talking about the process. And the process we're talking about is a completely new way that we have begun to learn through Leona of communicating with each other, of learning from each other, of identifying problems, understanding problems, and solving problems, a completely different approach. It's the process of the way that we function as a community. It is not the process that needs to be fixed in a particular functional area or sphere. Ooh, that's a cool slide. So, this is going to march out. I'm sorry. So this is what the timeline and the pathway sort of looks like in big chunks, and you can read it for yourselves. What we have been working on for the last number of years is what we call preparing for change and race-bias initiative activities and interventions. Where we are right now, at this moment in time in this room, is creating a climate for change, pulling people into the process, being as explicit as we can, using words that most people do not want to hear in a public setting. The guiding coalition is formed, we move into phase 3, phase 4, phase 5, and you get some sense there of what the timeline looks like as it marches out. This process, the process, is going to require time and patience. It's going to be trial and error. It's going to require the willingness to learn from and support each other as we make stupid mistakes on all sides of this. It's also going to require the ability to tolerate uncertainty and constant course corrections. There is no linear path to this. I think we're all convinced, again, having heard this over and over again from experts, if there was a linear path to this, someone would have figured out racism a long time ago. So, in terms of change management and the guiding coalition and people who decide to get involved to varying degrees, I want to tell you that from our perspective, based on where we started as individuals and as a group, how clueless we were, anyone can do this. You don't need a special skill set. Anyone who's committed to this can do it, but at the same time, not everyone is going to want to do it. And we completely respect and understand that. Most people probably will not want to take an incredibly active role. Everybody in this room is very, very busy doing their own thing, which makes perfect sense. But everyone is expected to contribute to the process. Everyone is expected to contribute to the process in some way, even if it's by just not resisting. That's our expectation of every student, every staff member, every faculty member here. You can talk about it, you can be open to learning from people, you can read books, you can go to events, you can get actively involved, you can get a little bit involved, but everyone's expected to contribute. And I will say that if the contribution is criticism, constructive inquiry, feedback, that's great. That's a great contribution. But be open about it and let us know what's going on and how you feel about it and what we need to do better. So the Guiding Coalition, the co-leads, the student leads will be finalized in the next couple of weeks. We'll all train together under Leona from April till about June and understand change management and how it functions. We will spend our first year together determining and overseeing the change projects and actions, identifying the options for implementation of those projects, making decisions about where energy and resources should be focused, determining how to hold people accountable, communicating with our constituents, and managing resistance. It probably still sounds kind of vague and big and all over the place. That's about as concrete as I can make it. And as I said before, part of the challenge of this is dealing with the uncertainty of a process that evolves organically, that changes our institution and isn't just a product of a change that we try to put in place temporarily. I struggled a lot in thinking about this presentation, of figuring out, is there some way I could describe this that was more visceral to people? And so what I wrote down is that we're trying to do two very scary things at the same time. One of them is rebuilding a house with no blueprint while the house is burning down around us. For me, that brings home to me the uncertainty of exactly the way forward with this, other than the fact that we are committed to doing it, but also the urgency of doing it. There is an urgency. This is a burning house. There are people every single day, students, staff, faculty, patients, everyone in every category, who suffer every day because of the systems that are in place in a society like ours, in a profession like ours, in our institution and institutions like ours all over the country. The house is burning down and the house needs to be rebuilt at the same time. So we pick off the top of the iceberg, event after event, and we try to correct it, and we drill down to the core of the iceberg and understand what is it that is perpetuating all of these problems. So that's it. That is it for my remarks. Survived. So what we want to do now is call up each of the sphere leads. They'll introduce themselves. They'll talk about what they're planning to do and what their sphere looks like, 2 or 3 minutes each. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. We're good? It just so happens that I'm the first sphere lead. So, yeah, I know. Can't give up the mic. So one of the things that we didn't, so I'm going to, somebody time me, 2 to 3 minutes. One of the things that we struggled with in the very beginning of this process is how large a circle are we drawing? Are we trying to address racism and bias in our little shop of 7 or 8 med ed team leaders? Are we trying to address it in the student body? Are we trying to address it in the teaching faculty? Are we going to affect the whole health system? And so what we decided is that we would start with medical education, but the reality is that half of medical education here takes place in the clinical environment. And the clinical environment is one of the core areas that students came to us 3.5 years ago and said, so much bias, so much racism in so many different ways. So we've chosen that the scope of this initiative is going to encompass medical education, but because of the clinical sphere, it's going to bleed out into the clinical learning environment. So the clinical sphere is mine. My co-leads are going to be Jonathan Ripp, who was just named the Senior Associate Dean for Wellness and Chief Wellness Officer. Natasha Ramsey, who is a black woman who's a 2nd or 3rd year pediatrics resident. Sashat Mack, who's a student who most, if not all of you know. They're my co-leads. And what we're going to do is to begin to weave this into everything that we do clinically. And from my perspective, I find myself now in a couple of different groups that I wasn't part of a year ago. One of them is a health equity work group that Dr. David Rich, the president of the hospital, chairs. One of them is the Physician Engagement Steering Committee that is chaired by the chief medical officers of all the hospitals in the health system. And one of them is a committee, I can't remember the name of, but the committee is driving a system-wide, a health system-wide culture change to change the behavior of all healthcare providers in the clinical environment, not necessarily related to racism and bias, just related to the way people practice clinical medicine here. Do they respect each other? Do they speak openly about things? Do they function as team members? Are they spending time with patients and informing them? I've got my feet now in these 3 different committees, and those are the places where we're going to plant sort of our stakes related to the Racism and Bias Initiative. All right, who's next, sphere lead? Curricular affairs. I think you're next. I did the student one. The student one is pending. We met with the students, and we're hoping in the next couple of weeks that they will come back to us with what kind of leadership structure they're interested in, who they want to be the student leads and co-leads in the guiding coalition. So that will be an evolving process. Dr. Karani.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I've written my remarks down because I also don't want to miss anything. So thank you all for coming. Oh, I'm too short. There's really no shortage of evidence that racism and bias is alive and well in medicine and science. Racial and ethnic health disparities abound. Racial categories are used regularly in biomedical research. Diagnostic and therapeutic clinical decisions are made every day based on guidelines that use a completely fallacious definition of race. Substantial numbers of health professionals hold false beliefs about the biological differences between Black and white patients. Race is taught as biologic in health professions curricula, and people of color remain deeply underrepresented in health professions programs and experience bias in the workforce with respect to hiring, retention, and promotion. None of this is new, but little to nothing has changed. I'm a proud, out woman of color, and these intersecting identities have shaped my every choice and experience in medicine, from my years as a student activist to my life as an attending physician. Yet it took students here with some or all of the same identities I have to really challenge me and hold me accountable in ways that I had never imagined. Thanks to them, my team in curricular affairs has been working diligently to address racism and bias in our curriculum and pedagogy. We have reviewed teaching materials for racism and bias, developed mechanisms for reporting racism and bias in the classroom and clinical learning environment, collaborated to offer trainings for staff and learners, hosted expert speakers to enhance our knowledge and skills, created learning experiences focused on structural competency concepts, published guidelines for addressing racism and bias in health professions education, and even provided critical and timely feedback to educators based on evaluation and performance data related to racism and bias. Yet despite all this work to date, we haven't had a meaningful impact on any of those dismal facts that I shared at the outset of this presentation. Today, as you've heard from Dr. Muller, we are moving forward with a much more integrated strategy intended to transform what we do in every way. And for my team and office, what this means is focusing on the process and people sides of change, in addition to the content space going forward. And while I do not know for sure that our work will change everything that I started this talk with, I do commit to our energy and dedication to this process and to making every effort to end racism and bias in health professions education. And so specifically from the process perspective, my team and I will ask critical questions, the difficult questions that drill down in the iceberg. How do we foster a collective sense of responsibility for realizing the need for systemic change? What can we learn from other educational communities to advance our efforts to eliminate racism and bias in the curriculum? And how do we incorporate anti-racist and racial justice perspective into all our teaching and learning approaches? And from the people perspective, We intend to ask questions like, how do we promote critical knowledge and skill development around racism and bias among our thousands of educators across the health system? How might we promote meaningful and transformative dialogue among educators and learners and colleagues about racism and bias? And how can we support all our future graduates to become committed and accountable advocates for eliminating racism and bias in medicine? So thank you all for being here and for your voices and strength.
Hi, I'm Valerie Parks. I'm also short, so here we go. I do admissions. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Admissions for the medical school. So I'm going to, in my 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey. When I got the job in admissions about 8 or 9 years ago, in my first week or so, I made an appointment and I met with Dr. Gary Butts. And in that meeting, it was August, and he said to me in the incoming class that's about to start, there are no black men. And both of us looked at each other, and for those of you who know me well, I think I teared up, which is not unusual, but and I think he probably did too. And since that time, we have met the admissions team and the CMCA team, and Michelle Sante from MedEd. So the group of us have met, and some people from the grad school as well, weekly, every Thursday at 12 noon, to try to talk about diversity and broadening diversity in the incoming class. And I think that we've had, I've learned a ton, and I think that we've had a lot of important outcomes and initiatives and learning that's gone on. We looked at the committee, all the committees. We implemented unconscious bias training. We started to talk about pipeline programs a lot, and obviously CMCA and CEYE had done years and years and years and years and years of work already. We looked at every interview form that we use to grade an interview or rank an interview, every screening form that we use to screen an application. And we did very well, I think, in admissions. And if you come to the admissions committee meetings, new members are always struck by how holistic we are, how we look at an applicant as a person, how we talk about distance traveled, in other words, how people have faced adversity, faced bias, have had socioeconomic or struggles, have been disadvantaged, et cetera. And we're very, very proud of that. However, I think we got to a certain place, and I think we then didn't continue to push. And I take that on as something where we need to do more. I think that it's hard for people on the committee to fully understand the difference between facing bias and facing adversity. In other words, they have trouble understanding certain phenomenons in society. And I think that where we have to move forward as we have transformational change is really starting to think about teaching and having faculty development and learning as a community in all of our committees that are evaluating applicants to the med school, to the early assurance program, to the graduate school, to faculty committees that are bringing in new faculty members, to GME committees. We have to all learn and understand more about bias, more about stereotype threat, more about imposter syndrome, more about microaggressions, more about structural racism that people are facing. And I think that has been, we went really far, but we sort of didn't push quite far enough. So our commitment in admissions to continue to work very closely with CMCA, to continue to really not just think about holistic admissions, but to learn more about the bias and racism that applicants are facing to all applicants to all parts of our school here. and to also think about holistic support. In other words, when people come into our institution, they then have to be holistically supported. So the two places that I see us really putting our stake down as we move forward are, number one, working with student affairs around holistic support, and number two, doing faculty development and development of all our selection committees around the difference between facing adversity and facing bias. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pete Gliotto from Student Affairs. If you look at the picture out in the foyer, I'm the guy to the right, if you can't recognize me. I kind of thought we looked like the Channel 4 news team in that picture. Rob, Michelle's fiance, actually told me the other day he thought we looked more like the Avengers, which I thought was a cooler analogy. And I asked my son, who's 13, I said, which Avenger am I? You know, he saw the picture. And he said, oh, you're Hawkeye. And I was like, that's like the lamest Avenger. But I have to say, it's apt, because I feel like the folks in that picture have done so much to move this discussion. And I've been really riding in that slipstream. So I just want to thank my teammates for pushing me. So I'm going to read two. So engaging in discussions about racism and bias have resulted in the most profound educational experience for me since I was trained as a resident. The fact that we discuss racism and bias and discuss this deeply at our weekly leadership meetings is a win for my larger team. Other wins include the diversity of the student affairs faculty advisors and the immense sensitivity they bring to their jobs. Student affairs is a challenging enterprise. We are tasked with supporting students through the transformative process of becoming a physician and also keeping students on task. These missions can sometimes feel like they run counter to each other. I think the balance between these aspects can best be done when we approach students with respect and curiosity, and I've been consistently impressed with the student affairs faculty and staff's ability to do exactly that. But I think we can do better. If you think about where Val just talked about where admissions is, we are way behind even where they are, and I think we need to learn from folks in CMC and admissions. We are eager to delve deeper into how we can achieve that, to get broad input, to collaborate, and to be really mindful about how we assist each student. Our increased pool of faculty advisors and hiring a director of academic success are major wins for us, and I feel we are poised to be really, to have a great impact, greater than ever before. I would like to introduce my two co-sphere leads. It's Dr. Alicia Hurtado and, from the Department of Psychiatry, and Dr. Monica Dweck from the Department of Ophthalmology. They're going to be the co-leads of the Student Affairs sphere. They're faculty advisors who are fantastic, and I'm really excited to work with them on this initiative. In the fall, we received the results of the students' comprehensive survey. So the students survey each other about all aspects of medical education: admissions, student affairs, curricular affairs, the pose and book kiosk, the cafeteria, everything. They give us a lot of quantitative data, and they give us some qualitative data. It's all anonymous. One comment that I saw back in the fall really is burned in my mind, I think every day. The tone at this school with regards to students struggling needs to change from punitive to positive and encouraging. We are constantly being told we're not good enough, and if we don't do X right, we'll fail. You can see the results of this in the intense stress that second years are under leading up to step one, and that early fourth year students go through leading up to applying to residency. I want to call out Dr. Gliotto specifically for being one of the major perpetrators of the above behavior, and also for being racist. Frankly, I think he needs to be fired from his position. This is still painful to read, but more painful is the fact that this is not the first time I've heard something like this in terms of the message that we as a school send, my role in sending the message, and finally, my racism. In fact, comments like these, perhaps not as explicitly stated, have been a running thread since I first started this job in 2011. I can rationalize this or defend myself, but ultimately I have to accept and reflect on why students say this and how who I am and what I do contributes to some students, many of them students of color, feeling further marginalized, alone, or avoidant of help. It is not okay if even just one student feels this way, I know it's more than one student. I know I can do better, and I too, like student affairs, am poised to have greater impact. I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to serve our students and the opportunity to continue to grow as an educator, physician, and person. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Michelle Sante, Associate Dean for Academic Administration. Joy Colelli and I are leads of the Student Resources sphere. I've struggled over the last few days wondering really what to say to you today, thinking about what you should know about me so that you can trust me in this work, thinking about what all I need to share with you so that I can trust myself in this space. I think I distilled it down to the time is now. I'm empowered to make this change, and I have lived a life that has paved the way for me to be right here today in front of you. Michelle Sante, Black woman, mother, lover, worker. The past 3 years have been hard and beautiful at the same time. I have seen my friends and colleagues grow, morph, and reach points that I would have never thought or would have thought were impossible just a short time ago. I have pushed my learning and my growing edge and have rediscovered part of who I am that finds her power in her Blackness, not in her position. I have worked with this leadership team to make substantive changes in how we support and offer resources to students, how we support and offer resources to faculty, and how we support and offer resources to staff who support our students. Our goal is transformational change. Transformational change in how we recruit you, how we teach you, how we support you, and how we care for you while you're here. We want to center equity in all of that and do it in ways that we can and in ways that we have not in the past. We have started over the last 2 academic cycles to increase and enhance the resources available to students, especially students of color and students with financial need. Resources have been an important foundation to all that we have done, and you've heard from my colleagues. We've supported students with DACA status. We've made residency interview processes a little less financially stressful for those students with extreme financial need. We have provided study materials and guides for board prep and have hired our first recruit in the Center for Learning and Development. We have expanded student training mental health services. We have identified additional space for students to have easy access to advising, support, and wellness programming. I launched the department-wide training on unconscious bias, and to date, we have trained over 100 faculty and staff who are sitting in front of you today and who teach and support our students. But that is not enough, and this is just the beginning. We know that racism and bias are operating in the fibers of all areas of this institution. We see the persistent patterns and behaviors that privilege students who are already privileged. Our goal is to dismantle these patterns by disrupting the behaviors that sustain them. We want to be the health system that trains professionals in the most diverse environment, providing care and education that is free of racism and bias. And we need you to do that with us. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joy Colelli, and I know I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. I'll be quick. During World War II, my dad spent 3 years fighting in the Pacific Theater, and when he returned stateside, he was stationed at an army camp in the Deep South. He shared with me and my brothers the discrimination he saw and felt in the Deep South, and he told me that as an American patriot, he was shocked and angered at what he witnessed. This experience awakened my dad, and when he returned to Brooklyn, he did so as a changed man. In the 50s, he organized a union where he worked. In the 60s, he was a civil rights activist and anti-Vietnam War protester. Social justice and activism was woven into the fabric of his life. He always encouraged me and guided me throughout my activism in the 60s, late 60s, 70s. I thought back then that we were ushering in a new age of reason, of fairness and acceptance. So much blood, sweat, and tears had been spent in the 60s and 70s. The ground shook in Brooklyn in 1968 when Dr. King was assassinated, and hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across the country to protest racism. Again, on May 4th, 1970, the ground shook when the National Guard troops opened fire on students peacefully demonstrating at Kent State. 4 were killed, 9 were wounded seriously. 2 days later, 4 million students, high school and college students, went on strike across the nation, closing universities and interrupting commerce in protest of the war and against the killings at Kent State. And yet, only 11 days after the Kent State, National Guard troops opened fire again on the students at Jackson State in Mississippi. 2 students killed, 10 students wounded. And then in October of 1970, the bombing of Sterling Hall at the UW-Madison campus took place. The 60s and the 70s were difficult for the whole country. But changes occurred, policies and practices changed, voting rights were passed, affirmative action became law, and I believed these changes were going to be permanent, but I was wrong. What I learned was that hitting people over the head with accusations of racism and sexism and imperialism shut them up and stopped them temporarily, but it didn't help them see the dawn of light. We find ourselves 50 years after the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 were passed, struggling to prevent voting rights from being eroded and making sure that political gerrymandering doesn't go unchallenged. It is still shocking to me that some people still don't see that racism and bias as unpatriotic and detrimental to our country. So now I'm ready to try a different type of activism, an activism that I know in my heart is smarter and a better route, although probably a slower route. An activism that starts with me, my self-awareness, and sharing that self-awareness with others. I'm not sure I know how to do that, but I'm willing to learn. Enrollment Services is committed to serving all students, and whether or not we unknowingly operate within the confines of structural racism and sexism and other forms of bias is unknown to me. But I'm committed to finding that out with the rest of my team. It's a collective process. It might sound trite to some that it doesn't matter what one small office does in the larger scheme of things, but I don't see it that way. I see every moment as a new opportunity and every action in life as important. My dad told me that his squadron was the first group of soldiers to land at Iwo Jima after the main battle. He said there were so many bodies in the bay that the PT boats couldn't land, and that he and the other soldiers had to make their way onto shore with rifles held high over their heads, wading through red water that licked their faces. What he remembered from that day was that he couldn't tell who was the enemy and who was the American. All of the body parts looked the same to him. Right then and there, at that very moment in his life, he knew that war could never be the answer, that it was barbarism, and that there had to be a better, civilized way to resolve differences. For me, social activism is not only doing the right thing, being a patriot to this great country, and making the world a better place. It's for me also honoring my dad and all that he fought for. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming out to helping us launch this initiative. And I want to personally thank our MedEd leadership team for co-owning this work. This is clearly one of the heaviest lifts for us as an institution, for us as your leadership, for me personally, professionally, perhaps for my entire career. And I hope that what you've appreciated from what you've heard so far this morning is that this launch represents a commitment that is authentic, that is genuine, and that we all have a role in. So I'm going to share just a couple of remarks before we open up to some Q&A. And I've written a few things down because there is so much that I could say to you this afternoon. But I do want to be at least a little bit coherent. This is an issue, as you can imagine, that touches me in so many ways, some that you can easily appreciate and others that you may not. I am a product, like many of us, as you've heard this afternoon, of the pre-civil rights era. And as I scan the audience, I think many of you can appreciate exactly what I mean by that. Growing up in East New York, Brooklyn, believe it or not, there were signs in stores in those days that very much remind me of some of the literature and readings from the deep old South. That was New York City back in the 60s. But here we are today. Here we are today. For some of us, racism and bias have been part of our lived experiences forever. And on the professional side, many would say that offices like the Office for Diversity and Inclusion at CMC exists largely because of racism and bias in medicine and in the health professions, that these are root causes to our existence. For decades, we've discussed the implications and impact of race and bias on our diversity and inclusion work. But only recently, in the past few years, have we begun to have intentional conversations about racism, how policies, practices, and structural issues perpetuate inequities on the one side and privileges on the other in much of what we do. So we acknowledge the roles that our students have played, and many of you in the room this afternoon, and pressing for an urgency in addressing these tough issues as they relate to our learning environment, the effectiveness in managing patients, and the diversity of our students, trainees, faculty, and staff. If not now, then when? The time for change is ripe, and our diversity office has become a necessary partner in shaping this new dialogue and the work that needs to be done for the transformational change that we seek. I would say that as a leadership team, we are at a very different place than when we started a few years ago. How we think about, discuss these issues, make decisions, and the improved trust that we have in each other. Our diversity office has partnered with medical education on this initiative from the inception, and we are a critical partner in the Med Ed leadership team. We bring a unique and critical perspective. Successfully implementing the RBI requires the full and continuous and authentic participation of all of us, or else we will fail. To date, we participated as full partners in all aspects of the thinking and planning. We've participated in several retreats, and we have gone off to be trained in depth in change management. And I want to acknowledge Leona Hess for bringing me to a different place in the way in which I think about this work and our leadership team. So in moving forward, diversity and inclusion will be a thread that permeates the RBI, specifically in the structure of the guiding coalition and across all the spheres. Diversity and inclusion will serve as the lens through which everyone involved in the change will use to develop a critical consciousness for doing the important work. And we will ensure that diversity of voices that reflect the diverse experiences and perspectives are included across all the spheres. Successfully moving the RBI forward requires thoughtful, authentic, inclusive planning and deliberate and thorough examination of some of the most difficult issues that we will face. This is more than a fix. We hope that we can all appreciate and recognize that we all have a stake, all of us in this room and in this Mount Sinai community, and the work that impacts our entire school and our system communities. So in closing, before we open up to some Q&A, I want to reiterate our collective commitment to this effort to have tangible, sustainable impact on the quality of life for all of us in the Sinai community, on the climate we learn and work in, and closing the opportunity and achievement gaps. Thank you.
So there are microphones in the aisles if people have questions or comments. We did want to end this by leaving you with a question that is unanswerable today, but it's something that we want you to walk away thinking about a lot and reaching out to any one of us if you have thoughts and suggestions either now or over the course of the next several weeks, months, years, depending on how long you'll be here. There's Change Now on the website is where we have posted in the past and will continue increasingly to put information related to this. There's a really cool video there. I don't know how many people have seen it, but all the information and updates will be communicated through Change Now as well as other venues. So please do take advantage of that and reach out to us and check out Change Now for more details. All right. So, questions, comments, thoughts?
Hi.
Hi.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your thoughts, first of all. And second of all, I guess I'd like to know, I'm a little bit confused about how those very people who were part of the administration, or are part of the administration that was the perpetrator of a lot of this racism that you guys have very eloquently spoken of, are now those who are tasked with leading the charge to change it. And I understand that all of you have gone through a lot of personal growth over this time, and partially due to the fact that there's a group of students who are holding you accountable. So I'm wondering now how and who you will be accountable to, since you are both those who are learning and those who are in charge. I don't know if that's a clear question, but I also wanted to just say that, despite all of this growth that you speak of, over the past year, there's been a number of very shocking and terrible incidents involving Black students in particular being failed by this institution in a lot of different ways. And so I'm wondering, to me, that doesn't really line up with change and growth. So if you have any comments on that.
Sure, and I want to be clear also that anyone who asks questions or comments, I open up the opportunity to respond to anyone, certainly on my team and other people in the audience. I think we've come to learn a couple of things, and some of them I think all of us acknowledged getting up here. A lot of individual efforts have been made, and we know that meaningful progress has not been made. So the fact that there are still incidents happening is tragic and horrifying at times, but is the reason that we've driven to this point in time and that we want to start this initiative and that we have started already. The other comment that I would make is, you used the word perpetrator or perpetrators. I am racist in the way that I think about people, the way I interact with people. I'm a perpetrator of the way the school has been run from that perspective. I also take great pride in other good stuff that I've done over the course of my 13 years here, but I fit neatly into that category. I am a perpetrator of racist thinking and biased thinking when it comes to medical students. And I don't believe that that helps at all to get to a solution to a problem. I think one of the important things that all of us have learned, and many of you have learned in your own walks of life unrelated to change management, is that that's not how the world works. That's not how problems are solved. That's not how systems are fixed. If you take healthcare, since many of us are familiar with healthcare as an example, there's always one person to point a finger at when there's a bad outcome for a patient. That's never the reason there was a bad outcome for a patient. It's always the undergirding systems, it's always something that involves every single person who has touched that patient's life or that student's life over the course of time. So yes, sometimes it looks like it was the intern who forgot to write the order or the nurse who gave the wrong medication, but it's never that person. It's pretty easy to point at the intern or the nurse and reprimand them, or fire them, or replace them. Never fixes the problem. It's rarely, if ever, the case that there is that bad egg, that bad perpetrator, who's the cause of all the problems. It's bringing that person to a place within a system that functions better and addressing all of those layers, I think, and I think we all agree, is the beginning of a way to find a solution. I don't know if anyone else has any comments to make about that or any other related questions that people have. Hey.
Hi. Oh, wow, okay. I'm Louis. I'm a second year, and I'm not good at public speaking, so I apologize if my voice breaks. So I think coming into second year, I was really, really excited about third year. I'm like, wow, we're finally going to be in the hospital, you know, doing the hands-on learning. That is the most important thing, right? But since last week, I have been nothing but anxious about next year. I'm nervous because there has been so much negative rhetoric around the clinical years, such as, you know, racism and bias, people being discriminated against, you know, getting a lower grade just because, you know, they're Black or Latino. And this seems to be an ongoing trend. I heard it from the fourth years last year. I hear it from the fourth and third years this year. And so I'm wondering if there have been people who have come forward and actually spoken about the discrimination, the mistreatment, and as MedEd, are you just acknowledging these complaints and these issues, or are you actually doing something about it? Because acknowledgement without action is just keeping us stagnant. So we're not doing anything by just saying, okay, yeah, thank you for telling us we're gonna do something about it, and then not do it. I think moving forward, I would like to know, how are all of you planning to change this in order for us as the medical students to be in our clinical years and actually see the change that you're telling us that is going to be implemented?
So excellent points. I will say a couple of things. A lot of people have come forward over the course of time, so there's been a lot of information that we have had access to and that we've gathered. We certainly have acknowledged it, and from my perspective, have on an individual basis for a single problem that has come up, have acted upon it in a variety of different ways. You know, we've gone around to every department and given grand rounds on mistreatment and harassment. We've started to provide unconscious bias training in clinical environments. We have a system for addressing individual faculty who are pointed out as having been the bad players for a particular incident that ranges anywhere from a warning to a meeting with the chairman to taking people off of the teaching service because of their behavior. And there are other things too, and I don't want to turn into a laundry list, but I do want to leave you with the sense that we know about what's going on, and we have ongoing efforts to try to address what's going on, but we have not gotten to the root of it. And we're determined to do that, as hard as it might be, or as much of an ongoing process as it's going to take for the rest of our lifetimes. It's not something that is simply going to go away. In the last couple of months, related in particular to AOA, which was brought to us by students and which we shared with students also from studies in the literature that we saw, we've looked at a ton of data on student grades, student clinical performance, student clinical evaluations, the bias that is packed into all of that stuff, and started to think about ways in which we can actually address it in a meaningful way. We had a meeting today, this afternoon, right before this, with a leadership from the Department of Medicine, and went over the data with them, and they are very motivated to do something about it with us. And we're going to do that with every clinical department that has that kind of data, because it looks the same across all clinical departments. So we're committed to doing something about it, but I don't know if this is the way that you necessarily intended it, because you asked, what are we going to do about it? And the we, from the perspective of this process, is going to have to be us. It doesn't mean that it has to be you or any particular student, and we are certainly not putting the burden of doing this on individual students or the student body. But it is clear to us at the same time that a group of 8 or 9 people who are smart and thoughtful and hardworking and trying to chip away at this thing is not going to change it. And so that is the push for this initiative. It's called change management, that is going to pull a lot of voices, all of the voices representative, into this process. From the top down, from my access now to the hospital presidents and the chief medical officers and the chief nursing officer, to the faculty who teach, to the clerkship directors, et cetera. I know it's not a great answer because I know it doesn't provide a solution to the problem. But that's where we are now. Any other questions or comments before we break for lunch?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for all of the work that you all have put into, I guess, arriving at this day. I know it's been a long journey over the last 4 years and many more years before that. I guess, Dr. Muller, at the beginning you alluded to the fact that many people are going to leave this room frustrated, and I think a lot of my classmates are really frustrated. I think that we have seen, just in this last year alone, I have a classmate who was, as a black man, was targeted for expulsion from this school. I have a classmate who, as a black woman, was written a report that she was guilty of harassing white students at this school. I have many classmates, I have many black classmates who last week found out really disappointing news in the residency match and felt like this was a signal of being unsupported and not not receiving the same advocacy that white students do at this school. So I think that these attitudes about wanting to change this school don't necessarily match how students have communicated to me as a white student that they are feeling. And I guess all of this is great, but it feels like there's also a lot of cultural capital that comes for white people getting up and saying, like, I am racist and I want to change, and that doesn't necessarily match the experiences of students at this school. And so I'm wondering how you balance kind of the cultural capital that is to be gained from putting up photos and publishing research about racism in medical education with the actual experiences of students at this school.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer the question. There's cultural capital for standing up here and saying the things that we said, the whole group of us, those of us who are white, black, brown, every other shade of color. And I mean, I guess at the end of the day, maybe this is the only reasonable answer that I have, although again, I welcome other people to address it. At the end of the day, if it feels to anyone in the room like this is all about cultural capital, it's nothing I can do. And it clearly doesn't align with the experiences of black and brown students, and from my perspective, is the only reason that we're standing here now, is because we've recognized that, we have come to recognize that, and it's taken us a long time, too long. But if at the end of the day, after a session like this, or the next couple of weeks, or the next few months, or the traction that the Guiding Coalition gets, there are people who still feel like the process is all about my cultural capital or someone else's cultural capital and not about a meaningful effort to make a difference, there's nothing I can do other than to continue to try to work against that resistance and bring people into the fold. But I really don't have an answer for that. I don't know if anyone else wants to give it a shot. We will do the best that we can, and we are committed to doing this for the rest of our lives here. And people in this room, people at our institution will either buy into that for that reason, or they won't, and we will figure out a way to navigate that over the course of time. Anybody else before we wrap up? Yep.
Hi.
Sorry, I'm just blinded by the light. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So to circle back somewhat to Charlotte's question, she asked about accountability, and that's something that you've spoken of a few times, and the importance of the process. So the first part of my question is, what are the specific mechanisms in the process to hold all the work that's being done accountable to students of color in particular? And then the second issue is what you have alluded to, is that for years, students of color have been putting time and intellectual effort and emotional labor and everything into this work. So how is the process going to unfold how is there going to be mechanisms for accountability within the process that also isn't overburdening students of color to be holding the group accountable?
Right. So from my perspective, and again, I open it up to anyone who wants to address it, the accountability piece takes two forms. One is the sort of traditional accountability. My boss is sitting right here and spent the hour and a half with us and has been in conversations with me for months and with Dr. Butts about this issue and will not let us off the hook. And I will not let my team off the hook, etc., in the sort of traditional hierarchical accountability. At the same time, the more important accountability is the public accountability around doing this in a very public way and pulling the public into this process. And that flows in the other direction too. My team will hold me accountable, and we will hold the dean accountable, and a lot of that flows up from students. We have no intention of putting the burden of this on students, any students, white, black, or anybody else, who isn't interested or able to commit to the process. Is absolutely understandable, but we want to create as many opportunities as there are for students who do want to get involved. So it's a very delicate balance. I think we totally understand that there are students who are 100% committed to this. It's part of their moral fiber, but don't have the ability, because of all of the stressors and pressures of being a medical student, of being involved. And that's totally fine. That's exactly the way that we approached the Guiding Coalition. In fact, we started off with a concept of those 6 spheres and a student sphere, right? And didn't think to bring students into each of our other spheres, because the last thing we want to do is put that on students. When we had a meeting with the students about the student sphere, one of the first questions that came up is, why aren't there opportunities for students to be co-leads in the other spheres? And I thought about it overnight because I was at that meeting, and the next morning I emailed the students who brought it up. And so I have a student on my sphere, but only because people came forward and said, look, I want to do this. I'm committed to this process. So we're very respectful of that, but it's going to be a very delicate balance, and it'll have to be sort of two-way in understanding what student desires, needs, expectations are, and how we can best meet them. So hopefully that answers your question. Yep.
No, this has been going on for a while. I just want to say that it's great to see that there are other folks in the institution who are here besides the students who have been involved with this from the very beginning and in MedEd, especially the staff members. I was just going to offer a suggestion for accountability, I think, to keep everyone on the loop, to maybe have another one of these at regular intervals, and that way we can get a pulse on where people feel this is going and how it's going.
You read our mind. That's exactly part of the broader communication. A lot of that will unfold on Change Now and in sort of ongoing communications that we send, but we will absolutely have sessions like this, obviously not frequently, but in intervals so that we can keep people apace and get feedback from folks.
Well, I hope that other folks can make it to these sessions again in the future. And there's one other person who has a question.
So I think that when I listen to these discussions, a quote that always pops up in my head is, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And to me, what I'm thinking about is that we are looking to the same people, the same institutions, the same processes that built this place to take it down, and I don't think that's going to happen. And what I'm really concerned about and invested in is that a lot of this conversation has been brought up by Black and brown students on campus, students who put in an enormous amount of time, who've made so many sacrifices, in a huge history, a long history that has been covered up and is still being covered up. How do we give voice to that history? How do we give voice to those students? How do we uplift those who have been working and building the skills they need to institute change in this institution?
So how do we do it part, again, there's 2 pieces to it. You know, the easy piece is describing how change management works, what the Guiding Coalition looks like. who gets to participate in the process, students driving the decision of how many students should be on the guiding coalition and what the student leadership process should look like. Student leadership structure should look like within the guiding coalition, seats at the table. That part is easy to describe. How that's going to unfold over the course of time, how that's going to make a major fundamental difference, I don't know. We're going to have to learn that together. I have an enormous amount of faith right now in this moment in time in the people who are on my team, and I have an enormous amount of faith in Leona Hess. She's led us through this process. She's a clear guiding light on where we need to head. She has no distractions when it comes to this institution or its other priorities or agendas. We're going to look to her very, very heavily, all of us, not just the leadership team, everyone who participates in this guiding coalition, to take us to a place that we need to get to over the course of time. I don't know what that's going to look like.
We've been talking a lot about Leona Hess, and also just this whole idea seems like it has to be vague because we don't know where we're going. So, and maybe the website is where you're directing us, but I would like to know a little bit more about the process that happened in your room with Leona Hess, who she is, and what she brings to the table.
And sorry, what was the last
And
piece?
just who is Leona Hess, and what did she do with you? And is she here now? Can she speak? And
sure.
Yeah, it seems like there's a sort of hole there that I don't get.
Do you want to get him to say a few words?
Hi, everybody. I am Leona Hess. I am purposely part of this, the beginning of the town hall and launching this is really just to start this discussion. And I think it's really important to think about transformational change as an emergent process, right? So today, right, is to set the context and to really think about the underlying structures, going a little bit deeper. And the real question is, like, how do you go about doing that, right? And part of that process is the guiding coalition. And I know that we're talking about it very broadly and kind of vaguely, and we're not necessarily getting into the details. Nor do I think that this is definitely the platform, because really we are forced now to kind of just respond to questions, opposed to sitting and engaging in a dialogue, which I think is really important and clearly needed. So I will, over the next couple of weeks and months, as well as the guiding coalition starts to form, to talk about the process. And not in an intellectual, like, these are the 5 steps that we're doing, right? But more about, like, what are we doing in the guiding coalition with multiple stakeholders, multiple, it's like diversity with, like, the big D, right? It's like all of the diversity and cultivating a environment in which, in that little, like, container, right? We're gonna focus on that container first before going out and emerging and bringing in the rest of the institution. And that is a skill and an art for all of us to learn about maybe doing things differently. So breaking down the power structures, acknowledging the power structures in the room, doing experiential learning exercises throughout the room to really get to the underlying structures. That can't happen if we're just sitting in a room and intellectualizing all of this stuff. We are going to be tapping into hearts and minds, not just policies and procedures and processes. It's a little bit of a different process. And so, like I say to everybody who's going to be participating in the guiding coalition, I might be asking you to think about things and even do things like that you're not used to maybe in your day-to-day, or maybe you are really used to it, and maybe we need to bring that and bring those voices. So it is an opportunity to potentially do things a little bit different. It will feel, probably for many people, a little strange, right? It may not be the traditional thing of thinking about how to do change, right? But transformational change is really about emerging processes, allowing opportunities to really engage in very deep and rich dialogue, and then moving that out, again, throughout the institution. Did that answer some of your questions? Yes, nice to meet you. And I do want to say this, please, I am really open to hearing from every one of you. I will make myself available. I think it's really important for this. It's not just these discrete, the Guiding Coalition or discrete meetings here and there. I really do have an open door. It is important to hear from all of you. So I look forward to moving on this work. And if you see me, please stop me, and we can talk.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you.